Hello, young historians. This is the first of the chapter summary videos that you all are going to be watching for class this year. There will be a chapter summary video for most of the chapters you read in the textbook, and you'll be expected to watch them to be prepared for the entrance exam you'll take before we begin each chapter in class. Now, these videos are designed to supplement the reading. My strong suggestion would be that you watch them after you do the readings. It will cover material that is in addition to the material in the text. Just reading or just watching isn't going to be enough. You're going to need to do both in order to understand the content that you need to understand to be ready for class and to pass those entrance exams. So the topic of Chapter 15 is the Renaissance in Europe. As you can see from the background image, Peter Bruegel's children's games, the Renaissance is a time of rebirth in Europe. Part of this rebirth is the rebirth of knowledge from ancient Greece and Rome, but part of it is a more literal rebirth, the triumph of life over death in Europe's recovery from the Black Plague. In Lesson 1, your reading deals with the Renaissance in Italy, and from that section I want to highlight three things. First being the Italian states themselves, and the ways in which Italy being divided into many small states shaped its culture during this time period. The second is going to be a closer look at Niccolo Machiavelli, and a basic look at the politics of the time period. And the third is going to be a look at Baldassare Castiglione and the Book of the Courtier as a way of getting an introduction to the social codes of the time. Lesson 2 takes something of a wider lensed look at the art and ideas of the Renaissance, and for that lesson there's two things I want to cast a spotlight on. The first is the concept of classical humanism and how classical education and thoughts spread during the Renaissance, setting up class in the coming weeks. And then after that, we'll wrap up with a very brief overview of some of the defining traits of art during the time period, with Renaissance art being one of the items most commonly associated with Europe in the 15th through 17th centuries. So that's our roadmap. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about the Italian states and how geography affected the Italian Renaissance. In particular, one aspect of geography, the fact that Italy was not a unified country, but that it was broken down into individual states. One of the things that the textbook points out about Italy during this time, and one of the things that you'll notice if you take a look at the map of Italy in 1500 at the right, is that Italy was not a single unified country, but rather a collection of highlighted states there. Italy existed as an idea, and if you were to describe something as being Italian, people generally understood what was meant by that, but Italy as a single political entity did not exist yet and wouldn't exist until the 1800s. Now, there's actually some advantages to this fractured nature. In fact, many of the most productive societies in world history are that way, not just in spite of, but because they were originally a fractured mess of states. Italy is one example, but to their north, their neighbor Germany is another one. Maybe the best example would be our own country, the United States. Having a lack of central authority has provided certain advantages here. The first advantage is that the lack of central leadership allowed each state to develop their own culture. In Italy, what this meant was a flourishing culture of art in Florence, while Milan and Venice developed very rich trading economies, and Rome remained the spiritual center of the world for most Christians. With each area able to have its own specialties, the culture of the whole becomes greater. The more distinct the regions, the richer the culture of the area as a whole. What makes American culture great? Well, it's Broadway in the north and it's country in the south. There's East Coast and West Coast hip-hop, and there's like 20 different kinds of barbecue in between. Similarly, by not having a single national identity, Italy ended up developing a rich, cosmopolitan culture during the years of the Renaissance. Another strength that's brought on by this fractious nature is that these states were then in direct competition with each other, which puts artists, writers, and other creative minds in high demand. If Michelangelo had been born in, let's say, Russia at the same time, there only would have been one major market for his work, and therefore it wouldn't have been as valued. However, as an Italian artist, we see that the Pope and the Medici family and the rulers of several different states all demanded Michelangelo's work, not only spreading his gift, but making it more prized. The third strength, and one that goes hand in hand with the last one, is that multiple states means multiple rulers. Multiple rulers meant a number of wealthy ruling families developing. This is going to mean that while wealth certainly wasn't divided equally in Italy, wealth wasn't divided equally anywhere in Europe at this point in time, there were at least multiple families that were capable of funding or patronizing different cultural developments, be they artistic, scientific, or eventually in the world of exploration. You had more patrons, that is to say, more wealthy sponsors of art and scientific development, in Italy than you had in other parts of Europe, meaning that many of the good things to happen in the 1500s and 1600s would end up happening in Italy first. There were, however, some disadvantages to not having a unifying government in Italy at this time, and indeed disadvantages to any nation that doesn't have a unifying central government. The first would be the absence of a single strong leader. And while that might have been what allowed culture to flourish, it did mean that Italy was highly susceptible to attack during this time period. With the papacy, the Pope, as the only unifying figure, Italy found itself subject to invasion from the Ottomans, the French, and the Austrians over the course of the 16th century. Not having a central leader meant that Venice or Milan or any other state was left to defend itself with the rest of Italy not really caring that much until Rome was directly in jeopardy. And even then, their defense was much too disorganized to do much of anything about it, leading to the costly Italian wars during the time period. And another undermining factor was, why should they? These states were in cultural and economic conflict with each other, so why should they have helped each other out in times of need? The same competition that made Italy great in some ways left it laughably weak when it came to defending itself. Personally, as a political scientist, one of the items that I find most interesting in Chapter 15, Lesson 1, is the political philosophy of Niccolo Machiavelli. What's important for us to understand is that prior to Machiavelli, political theory wasn't really a major field of study. Most social science, or even social studies up until that point, were either in the field of history or in the field of philosophy/ethics. And the ethical philosophy of the Middle Ages had largely been dominated by traditional views of Christian morality. We looked at the excerpt in class from St. Thomas Aquinas, where he emphasizes the need for compassion and empathy. Well, as you read in Chapter 15, Lesson 1, Machiavelli has no real interest in compassion, only an interest in understanding the nature of power, in particular, how individuals get and maintain power. Machiavelli's most famous work was a short book entitled The Prince, and it was published in 1532, dedicated to the lesser Lorenzo of the Medici family, Lorenzo Piero de' Medici, the former ruler of the city-state of Florence. And it was sort of a how-to guide for rulers of city-states, and Machiavelli refers to those rulers using the generic term of princes. So when he's using the term prince, he's not talking about a son of a Disney king. What he is talking about is the ruler of one of those small Italian states. And it's a guide for how to most effectively use power. And through a study of history and current politics, Machiavelli claims that the most effective way to use power has very little to do with compassion. The first and probably most enduring piece of advice that comes from Machiavelli's The Prince is the claim that, quote, the ends justify the means. This despite the fact that Machiavelli never actually wrote those words, but whatever, we'll roll with it. The spirit of the words at least remain true to the Machiavellian attitude. The ends, which is to say the results, what you end up getting at the end, justify the means, the process for getting there. Really, the way, what you get at the end makes the way that you got it worthwhile or right, according to a Machiavellian worldview. That's really the key to what was revolutionary about Machiavelli's political philosophy. Machiavellian politics are result-oriented rather than process-oriented. They look at what brings about end results, ignoring how those results were achieved. Machiavelli is a drastic departure from the way that the church-centered politics worked in the centuries before. The second nugget of wisdom that we get from Machiavelli is the oft-cited parable about the ruler needing to be both a lion and a fox, with the lion representing not just strength, but honor as well, whereas the fox is associated with cleverness and an ability to root out traps. Really, if we want the spirit of this quotation without going to the original quotation itself, we can go to the Machiavelli quote in your textbook highlighted on page 293. In that quote it says that, quote, everyone realizes how praiseworthy it is for a prince to honor his word and to be straightforward rather than crafty in his dealings. Nonetheless, contemporary experience shows that princes who have achieved great things have been those who have given their word lightly, who have known how to trick men with their cunning, and whom, in the end, have overcome those abiding by honest principles. Everyone loves a good guy who plays by the rules, Machiavelli tells us, which is why there's so much to be gained by taking advantage of good guys. What Machiavelli is doing is he is using a knowledge of history and a study of human behavior. Really, he's using very early social studies to justify immorality and at least morally questionable behavior in politics. Our third and final Machiavelli axiom is his famous one that if a ruler needs to choose between being feared and being loved, he should choose instead to be feared. Why? Men can't be trusted according to Machiavelli, and Machiavelli apparently can't be trusted according to Machiavelli, so no doubt he would feel this way given his own apparent lack of a moral compass. And therefore it's safer to rely on a man's fear of punishment than it is to rely on his love and loyalty. Effectively, Machiavelli makes the claim that a harsh ruler will be safer than a fair ruler. And by safer, what we mean is that a harsh ruler will be safer in his own power. He will be more assured that he will be ruling tomorrow than a fair ruler would be. For now, it's important for us to know this as one of the most oftenly quoted sentiments of Machiavelli, but file this thought away for a few weeks as we'll begin to investigate whether or not this claim is actually accurate in Chapter 19. You might be wondering why a sociopathic dirtbag writing a book 500 years ago ends up in our study of history, and the reason why we study Machiavelli and why I wanted to highlight him here is because of one of the things that you all told me in class. When we were talking about what defines history, overwhelmingly you said that history is most important when it continues to affect the world. Well, Machiavelli is really going to be a figure who has his fingerprints all over a number of things that we are going to be doing this year. Especially when we get to Otto von Bismarck, an important figure in German history, the Iron Chancellor who unified Germany in 1870. Bismarck establishes his own political theory of what he calls realpolitik, but which is very much built on Machiavelli's principles. Or maybe lack of principles, if we want to look at it that way. Machiavelli also shows up in pop culture too, with the rapper Tupac actually using Machiavelli as a pseudonym at various times and making multiple references to him, and he's simply referenced throughout pop culture in a number of other places, including The Office scene there. Machiavelli remains a famous and commonly referenced figure centuries after his death, and the word Machiavellian now is shorthand for anyone who is untrustworthy and manipulative. Maybe it's not the best legacy to have in history, but it is a legacy nonetheless. Third item that I want to highlight from Chapter 15, Lesson 1 is another great book referenced in that lesson, which is Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. Now, The Book of the Courtier, unlike The Prince, is a novel. It was really designed to be an etiquette book for its time period. I mean, when we refer to the book as a novel, it is something that has a story to it, it is something that has characters and a plot. Although in the case of the Book of the Courtier, those are all just really thin smoke and mirrors, so Castiglione can lecture his readers on what an ideal Renaissance man should look like. We may have heard this phrase before, the idea of a Renaissance man being used to describe someone who is talented in multiple fields, and that phrase really stems, or at least that concept, if not that actual phrase, really stems from the work of Baldassare Castiglione. Castiglione looked at this time of rebirth and learning in Europe and noticed that the man of his age was becoming more multidimensional, more worldly, and he established a number of criteria that he felt defined his age. A man should be well read. He should be capable of playing both musical instruments and sports. He should be conversant in multiple language. All sorts of guidelines are given to us by Baldassare Castiglione, and if we really look at them, we can see that based on the experiences that Castiglione is writing about, the quality of life for upper-class men is getting much better in Europe. After all, if someone has the time and ability to not only learn to play a musical instrument, but also to own a musical instrument and read books about how everyone should be able to play a musical instrument, we've hit a point in history where there's clearly a group of at least upper-class men who have some kind of leisure time on their hands. And we see that reflected throughout the Renaissance, with conversations of politics and appreciations of fine art. Clearly, there's a class of adult males that has moved beyond being concerned about mere survival and is able to appreciate a much higher standard of living. However, this isn't reflected for everyone in Renaissance life, though. The vast majority of Europe still could not read, and even if they could, they would not be able to recognize the elite society that Castiglione was writing about. Keep in mind, it's the book of the courtier, the book of the people who were at court. And we're talking about royal court here, not court like Judge Joe Brown or Judge Judy court. Castiglione's writings show an improving standard of living, but if you were the average person alive at this time, the odds that that improving standard of living affected you were pretty low, and the odds are that the world that Castiglione was describing was invisible to you. Also important is that there's another group that Castiglione leaves out of his description. You may have noticed the use of the phrase Renaissance man. But these traits were not automatically transferable across gender, according to Castiglione. In fact, if we take a look at Castiglione's thoughts on women, he writes for us that women are imperfect creatures and consequently have less dignity than men, and that they are not capable of the same virtues that men are capable of. Very learned men have written that since nature always intends and plans to make things the most perfect, she would constantly bring forth men if she could, and that when a woman is born, it's a defect or a mistake of nature, and contrary to what she would wish to do. Thus, a woman can be said to be a creature produced by chance and accident. Nevertheless, since these defects in women are the fault of nature that made them so, we ought not on that account to despise them or fail to show them the respect which is their due. Yikes. So, while Castiglione writes about life getting better and new expectations of leisure and education to match it, clearly that didn't apply to half the world in his mind. But more to the point, it didn't apply to much of the world at all, when you consider that Castiglione was only writing about the lifestyle of the privileged. But the spread of education was real, and education, both formal and informal, was hitting Europe in a big way during the Renaissance. Part of this is because of a change in values. During the Middle Ages in Europe, the only real forms of education that existed were religious education, being educated in the Catholic Church in a preparation for life as a priest or a monk, and education in a given craft such as blacksmithing or similar. It's really with the emergence of Francesco Petrarch, yes, the guy with the doofy leaf crown and the imaginary girlfriend who I was making fun of in class, that Francesco Petrarch, that there is an interest in a different form of education, humanities, or what we would now call classical education. Classical because of its connection to the civilizations of Greece and Rome. This education, education in human affairs rather than religious affairs, came to be the root of the modern liberal arts education. Everything that you learn in your English, history, language, and drama classes falls into the study of the humanities, the liberal arts, and makes up that very important way of thinking and knowing that I talked about in class a few days ago. This manner of education was omnipresent. It was everywhere up until the past century. For example, take a look at the course catalog from University of North Carolina in 1900. If you were a freshman in the UNC class of 1904, this is what your education would look like. 13 classes, all of them based on Greek and Latin grammar, with 2 classes in religion. It looks like they had a math professor and a chemistry professor, but those weren't for until after one got through the basics of an education. And even 100 years ago, the basics of an education were studying the Greeks and studying the Romans. So that's one of the keys to Renaissance thought, is this revival of Greco-Roman culture as being the shibboleth of education, and really from 1500 up until the mid-1800s, education will look very much the same, very much this Renaissance classical education style, at least in the Western world. The other major game changer, though, in education, at least during the Renaissance, in addition to stressing the importance of studying human affairs and ancient civilization, was that ideas were now spreading more quickly and more accurately, and this itself was the product of 2 major changes during the time period, the first of which was the use of the vernacular. Now, your textbook defines the vernacular, and we'll spend a full class on it, so I won't spend any time on it here, other than to say that it made sharing and spreading ideas possible. Even if a Francesco Petrarch figure, or if Niccolo Machiavelli as a figure had existed 100 years earlier, it wouldn't have mattered if their works were only read by the educated few who had been through a classical education in Latin. Secondly, and equally importantly, though, was the development of the printing press, an invention which had been around in China for centuries, but was first utilized by Johannes Gutenberg in European culture. Again, we'll capture the topic in much more depth in class, but what Again, we'll capture the topic in much more depth in class, but that works were not only in the local language, but could now be produced en masse, changes the face of education forever. Not just schools, but the very question of what does it mean to be a knowledgeable human being is changing because of these inventions and changing trends in thought. Last but certainly not least, the Renaissance is most often associated with the beautiful art of its time period. We have a favorite of mine up in the background here. Many of you may recognize it from my classroom, and we'll talk about it in one of our upcoming lessons. One of the reasons why Renaissance art was such a big deal is because of how drastically different it looked from art that came before it. But it's historically significant not just because it's pretty, but because those traits that made the art of the Renaissance look different than medieval art also offer us a window into what was different about the time period as a whole. One of the traits that set Renaissance art apart from the earlier time periods was that there was more use of vibrant colors. This isn't just important for setting the mood of an art piece, with more vibrant colors being suggestive of a time period where the Black Plague was waning and life was triumphing in many places on the European continent, but it's also telling about the creation of the piece itself. The fact that the colors were more vibrant lets us know that the artist had access to new and better paints, partially a product of invention, largely a product of a richer trade market in between states. Furthermore, these colors have remained vibrant over time because artists knew what was going into their paints and chose paint compositions that would withstand the wear of time. The Van Eyck brothers, two very famous Dutch artists of the time, Flemish artists of the time, were credited for a long time with being the first humans to invent oil-based paint, until it was revealed naturally that they had been used in China for over 1,000 years prior, but that'll just be a recurring theme in our class. The point still stands, though, that there was a new scientific way of looking at art and that the energy that we see in Renaissance art is something that endures not just because of the artist's passion, but because of changing technology and new discoveries that were allowing for this type of art. Another place where we saw the intersection of art and science was in the way that the human figure was portrayed in art. If you were to take a look at medieval art, and we did take a quick glance at it, a little bit of it in class with the image from the medical textbook showing the signs of the zodiac embedded inside our very long-limbed man, there was almost a deliberate emphasis on not showing the human body as it really was. After all, the Middle Ages had a high emphasis on spirituality and piety, and it was seen as sinful to spend too much time looking at or thinking about the human form. Those taboos disappear to some extent in the Renaissance period, and there will be free rein for artists, most notably Michelangelo, to showcase real human anatomy in their artwork. Da Vinci and Michelangelo, in fact, both performed controversial dissections of human cadavers, human corpses, to get a better understanding of the human body. Something that certainly shows the changing moral standards, but also the changing scientific mindset of the time. Thirdly, and covered in your textbook, was the use of perspective, the use of geometry to make pictures appear three-dimensional. But then we'll get to the last one, and something I'd actually caution you against is the last item on here, and that is to try to create an overall theme for Renaissance artwork. Oftentimes, scholars will point at the Renaissance as being a time where religion played a decreased role in art. But each of these Renaissance masters painted countless images of Christ and the Virgin Mary, so especially when it comes to the Italian Renaissance, secularism, that is, an absence of religious influence, is right out as a theme. Some point to the increased presence of nature in pastoral scenes, in landscape art in the Renaissance, but the Northern Renaissance love of portraiture really blows that out of the water. When it comes to Renaissance work, we need to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush. And to see the central themes that might not be there. After all, for all that I'm stressing, the art of the time reveals a changing attitude about humanity and science. Maybe it's best just to appreciate the pieces individually or as an artist's collective body for what they are. We'll do that for at least one of my favorite artists, Peter Bruegel, coming up in class. And those of you who are interested in this topic, I'd highly suggest the Renaissance Art Museum tour as an honors module selection for this chapter. For the rest of you, this concludes our Chapter 15 lecture. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or ask me in class, but you're good to take the entrance exam starting now. Good luck and Spartan up!